Hi guys, in this video I will show you how to paint a peacock bird. Now this is a gorgeous bird, but it may be a little bit intimidating if you're new to watercolor because of all the shimmering colors and different textures on feathers. But don't worry, I'm going to take you through the process step by step, and I'm going to explain exactly how to layer your watercolors so you get a beautiful result in the end. So if you find this video useful, don't forget to subscribe. Today we're going to cover lots of very important topics: the layering technique, how to create texture on feathers. We're going to talk a little bit about the masking fluid, the direction of light, and how you can use it in order to organize your colors, the brush strokes that you will need in order to create a realistic feather details. All the supplies I'm using are listed in the video description, but don't feel pressured to use the exact same pigments. You may find similar pigments in your palette. We will need a bunch of blues and a bunch of greens, some browns, and maybe a purple and a yellow. You'll need watercolor paper, and I highly recommend getting professional 100% cotton watercolor paper, something like 140 pounds or above. In terms of the brushes, you may go with a real Kolinsky Sable, which is what I'm using. If you don't have a real Kolinsky Sable brush, you just need 2 synthetic brushes, one in size maybe 4 or 5 for larger washes, and something small in size 0 or 1 for those tiny details. We will also need some masking fluid and an applicator for this fluid. Now, if you don't have masking fluid, don't worry, you can still do the whole tutorial. All you will need to do is come back to the painting after all your layers are finished and paint those white parts, maybe with white gouache or white watercolor. So if you're ready, let's begin. In order to get started, first we need to mask the white parts of the bird, and primarily it's going to be around the eye, the tiny details over there, and maybe a few feathers on the tail. The reason why we're doing this is because we want to protect the white paper from the color that we're going to be applying. So I'm just going to draw a couple of lines on the tail to identify the large feathers. And now let's start with our background wash. So we're painting from light to dark, meaning that our first layers are going to be super light, not a lot of pigment there, lots of water, and feel free to use any blues that you have on hand. What I'm using here is phthalo blue and ultramarine blue, and I'm just covering the entire body of the bird, and I'm leaving the tail without any color right now because it's going to have a different palette. So I'm mixing my favorite blues here, light and dark, and I am not afraid to go over the bird's head because we masked those white areas. So I'm just going softly with my brush, and I'm adding a bit more pigment where the bird is in the shadow. So essentially at the bottom where the light is not really reaching the feathers, and on the right hand side. The reason why I'm doing this is because the source of light is on the left hand side. So what I'm trying to show here is that our highlight, our lightest area of the bird, is on the left, on top. Everywhere else I can put large strokes with more saturated pigment, and there on top left I'm leaving it quite light. Now back to the head of the bird, I'm gonna add a little bit more pigment, and as my water is drying out, I'm just adding more and more shadow definition on more on the right hand side and at the bottom. As my water is drying out, I have a little bit more control, so I'm trying to add strokes to the body, just imitating the direction of feathers, just with the tip of my brush. And now I'm moving down with my indigo blue. You can use black or mix soft black with blue, and purple. So I want to go really dark at the bottom because that area is in the shadow. And then in the spot where I want to really leave the white paper more white and remove the pigment that may be spread into that area, I just dropped a few blooms, meaning I just picked up some clear water and I left those drops of water on the bird, so you can see them sort of spreading and pushing the pigment out. It creates a very interesting effect that you can only do with watercolors. So I continue going around. Again, if you're using quality watercolor paper, your paper should be still quite wet. And I'm adding now my purples and phthalo green all around. Underneath the head, some of the areas around the neck where I know the shadows are, and I'm just dropping it with the tip of my brush. Now let's do the eye. So I'm using brown matter here. You can use any kind of warm brown color, and just gonna also do a couple of outlines on the beak, mixing my purple and brown matter and going over the beak and leaving some of the highlights without any color. Now let's add a few extra details on the head. Now the reason why I'm gonna do more details here is because we really want to focus the attention on the eye and the head of the bird, so that the viewer really has a clear focus when they're looking at the painting. So the more texture you add here, the more interest there will be, and the eye will gravitate towards the bird's head. So I'm just going to do a couple of small strokes here, just in my darker areas on the neck, in the shadow, with my deep green. Feel free to use emerald green or any kind of deep green that you have. And again, I'm just accentuating some of the shadows. I really want to have that beautiful texture around the eye and on the neck, because this is really the center of our composition. Now it's time for the background layer on the tail. So just like we did with the bird's body, first thing I'm going to do is cover the entire area with water and then start dropping my colors. So I'm using Winsor & Newton green, yellow shade, and a little bit of my olive green. So I'm just sort of following the direction of the feathers. It's horizontal and sort of curving down, and I'm using those two colors on the end of the feathers and in the middle, and I'm watching the water spread, and it creates these beautiful transitions. So just really light color. Again, this is just a background layer. We're not adding too much pigment. And now I'm gonna do a bit of brown. This is burnt umber, and I'm going to put it more towards the base of the tail and going down where you can see some of the smaller feathers of the body. So you can see my masking fluid is sort of shining through. That's where the pigment is not going to touch the paper. You can see sort of those yellowish outlines, and so I'm covering that whole area with brown, making it more saturated and darker towards the blue part of the bird. I'm adding more and more color going down, and just a few drops along those lines where I know the very long feathers are. So those are the shadows that you would see under each feather. And now I'm just gonna let it dry and add a bit of dioxazine purple. Feel free to use any saturated purple that you have. And again, I'm just putting it close to the base. The reason why I'm doing this is because I don't want a really hard separation between blue and the green-brown tail. I want to kind of tie it together visually, so that purple will help me bring the two sides of the bird closer together. I'm also adding it a bit to the feathers so that it's cohesive. Again, I'm just trying to identify where the shadow would be under each long feather. And now a few drops of blue. Again, this is just to keep my palette cohesive so that they're it doesn't look like we have two separate palettes, two separate paintings. The blue will blend nicely with my greens and browns and help me kind of keep the overall composition together visually. And now I'm going to do the crown. So I'm using my ultramarine blue and my phthalo blue, and I'm just going over with my background layer. Again, very, very light. I'm just outlining those kind of triangular shapes of the crown feathers, adding a bit more pigment towards the base and finishing it up with even more saturated color, because I feel like, again, the source of light is on the left, so there will be more shadows in that area. Final stroke, just a bit of blue under the beak. And now let's work on the definition layer. The definition layer is all about defining our shadows, accentuating highlights, and this is also where we're starting to add a bit more detail and texture. So what I'm doing first is I'm going over the body of the peacock and I'm adding smaller details in that area on the left, first with my brown and purple and then with green. These are the tiny details that we see sort of peeking out from the back, and I'm going to go over with my miniature brush and just add a little bit of definition there. First with lighter colors and then a little bit more dark with my purple on top of green. Now I'm going to double down on the shadow area at the bottom of the peacock, and I'm using my indigo, which is almost like black. You can use soft black or mix your darker blue with your black, but indigo works beautifully here. So I'm just going over, getting really dark at the bottom there. Again, remember our source of light is on the left, so I'm leaving the highlight on top of the peacock's back, and I'm just accentuating the shadows around the body. So here I go on the right. At the bottom, my strokes are bigger, more saturated. This is our definition layer, so we can go with a more saturated color here. Again, remember we're painting light to dark, and this is how watercolor works. So we started quite light and now we're adding another layer on top. So I'm just using the tip of my brush now that my larger strokes are complete, and I'm just adding a bit more texture on the feathers where I see there's some variation in the reference photo, and I'm switching from my darker color now to a lighter blue. It's my ultramarine, and I'm just going over the entire bottom side with my brush, spreading the color and using clear water to blend it into the background, again leaving that big highlight without any color, using a tapping motion with the tip of my brush, just tiny little strokes imitating the feathers and following the direction of the feathers, which is quite important when you're painting birds, is to make sure that you're following exactly where those feathers are pointing. So again, just tap 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 with the tip of my brush. I don't know why I lift my pinky when I do that. That's really a mystery to me, but something that happens. I'm weird like that. Okay, so I think we're getting to the point where you can kind of see the texture emerging and some of the feathers are becoming more defined, and all we're doing is just adding a little bit of shadow and outlining the highlight areas so they stand out more. Again, I'm blending it with clear water, that stroke that I did all around the highlight, so that it blends nicely into the background. Even more pigment at the bottom. I feel like there's still a long way to go in terms of how dark we can get. So I will just continue this way until I'm happy with this texture. Now moving on to the neck. Again, I did a large wash of ultramarine just to make it a bit darker. And now I'm gonna go into that shadow area with a really pigmented stroke and define that shadow. Again, I'm doing shorter strokes now, and now I'm gonna go to the crown and put a light wash of brown just underneath those crown feathers. The stems will be left blank because we put some masking fluid there, and this layer will help us define those feathers. And now let's do the tail and define our shadows here. So first I'm gonna paint a large shadow at the base of the tail with my purple. This is dioxazine purple. Feel free to use any other purple or dark brown if you have. And I'm going from the base up. And now I'm painting wet on dry, meaning the bottom layer is completely dry, and I'm just using my brush to define the shadows on each long feather. And I'm using those strokes that we put down with masking fluid as a guide to remind me where my shadows should be. So here I go, a large stroke and then a few smaller strokes to define the feather. And I'm just gonna do this for each feather. It doesn't matter exactly where you land with these strokes as long as you know that you're outlining the feather, and as long as you decide on where your feathers should be, it doesn't have to look exactly like mine. Notice that I'm going over what I've already painted in my background layer, so I'm just essentially defining and accentuating those shadows in the areas where I've already laid down some cool purple color. So that's why the background layer is so important, because it will help you define every subsequent layer. And now another large shadow right underneath the belly. And I'm not afraid to go very pigmented, because when my colors dry out, because this is cotton paper, they're gonna look a little bit lighter than when they do when they're still wet. So now let's wait until everything is completely dry so you don't lift any color, and erase your masking fluid with your eraser. I like using these thin retractable erasers because they really help me get into the area that I really need to get into without lifting the color around it. Now, step 4 is our accent layer, and that's where we're really going to finish off the feathers and accentuate all the different parts that we want to accentuate. Remember, we started by talking about how the center of attention is really the peacock's head and the eye. So we're going to put in a lot of work here just with the tip of our brush, going around and helping accentuate all the bumps and grooves on peacock's head. So lots of dark green around the head. You can use dark green or dark blue. I'm sort of going from one to another. Right now I'm using dark green. Again, at the bottom, that's where the shadow should be, going down the neck. And my strokes are really small here because the feathers are not long here, so that's why I'm using that really short stroke, almost like a dot. Now let me outline the eye. I'm using purple here. It's a great complement to warm brown. So I'm gonna go around and put that shadow on top of the eye. It's a little bit more on top than at the bottom because of the reflection. A few shadows on the beak, underneath the beak, and around. Now let's accentuate our crown feathers. I'm just gonna put down a few thin lines with a bit more color at the base. So they don't have to be continuous, you can interrupt them, but The point is that they start at the base of the feather. You can blend it with your blue, and then you can drag it down towards the top of the peacock's head. You can also outline a few feathers on the crown. This will look really nice, and again, the more details we add around the head of the bird, the more interesting it's going to look, and the eye will gravitate towards that area because we have so much definition here. So I'm just going with the tip of my brush and outlining those crown feathers, a bit more brown at the base to help us define the feather base, and a bit more brown here on the beak just to tie it all together. Now I'm gonna go with my darkest deep indigo blue and create a nice deep shadow under the head and then move down. There's still an opportunity to add some shadows all around the body of the bird, so I'm gonna add a few layers here and there. And now let's finish off the tail with some accents. I'm starting with my burnt umber. Feel free to use any of your darker browns, and I'm just going over the feathers and deepening those shadows and accentuating the details on the feathers. Just a few strokes with the tip of my brush all around the tail. And now I'm going with my warmer brown, my brown matter, and I'm creating another layer, another shadow at the base of the peacock tail, just underneath the chest of the bird. You can use the same deep brown that you used on other shadows, or you can use something warmer like I'm doing here. And again, I'm doing a few very small strokes towards the end of each feather. I'm even going to put a few strokes of my warm brown on the chest of the peacock and a bit at the bottom, and this is to help me visually connect the two parts of the bird, the blue and the brown-green tail. I'm also going to do a few warm brown strokes right there under the crown feathers, just dragging my brush down. And now grab your cooking salt. I'm going to show you a neat little trick. We're going to create some beautiful textures on the background. So first I'm going to make my background wet, just with clear water. And then I'm going to drop a little bit of quinacridone gold. You can use a warm yellow or even light orange. A few more drops of brown matter closer to the neck of the peacock, and I'm just watching the pigments spread. And now I'm going to put a little bit of salt, just a few drops, and what's going to happen is the salt is going to interact with the pigment in the water and create really interesting texture effects. Something you can't do simply with the brush, and this is just for some visual interest. Once it's all dry, in about 20 minutes, I'm just going to brush the salt away, and we're done. Here's our beautiful peacock. Thanks guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it useful and you want to come back, do subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can find out when I publish my next tutorial. I really enjoy painting the peacock with you, and I hope to see you next week.